Let me start with you, Phil. Chairman Nadler and various academics, including Professor Lawrence Tribe, say the impeachment process has begun. Speaker Pelosi says it has not. Why is this an argument, and why is it important?
Once a formal inquiry of impeachment begins, the Judiciary Committee takes over, and most of the other committees, both in the House and the Senate, are silenced. Now, there are pluses and minuses to this. An impeachment inquiry has a deeper penetration of the information that the executive can provide. And ordinary claims of privilege, for example, that would prevail in other places, in the courts, for example, give way to an impeachment inquiry. So the House, and particularly the Judiciary Committee, gets a much deeper catchment for its inquiry. The downside is that other committees, the intelligence committees in the House, and particularly the intelligence committee in the Senate, are now put off from their inquiries, and their ability to gather information is stilled. So I can see why, on the one hand, the chairman of the committee would want to say the process is underway so he can begin this more far-reaching inquiry. But I can also see why the speaker, who still perhaps hopes for more bipartisan support and for inquiries into the specifically intelligence aspects of it by the Senate committee, some more bipartisan committee than exists in the House, might be something she could favor.
Controversy is the enemy of an incumbent legislator, man or woman, Republican or Democrat. And so what Nancy Pelosi is wrestling with is she has some members that if they do formal impeachment and attempt to impeach the president, some of her members will lose. Some members have such a partisan district that they have no sense of what it's like to represent Iowa, no sense of what it's like to represent Montana. Rural members have no sense of what it's like to represent Bronx. And so every member has a unique challenge in fitting this in. So the bottom line is, I just want you to understand it's personal to every member, and you can say they should do the right thing, but the right thing in their own district may seem a little different. I will conclude by saying this to you. I think Donald Trump is dangerous. I think he's destructive. And I fear that he's even going to be in office another year. And I totally fear that he would have 4 more years because he's appealing to the dark side of everyone in this country and not the good side. And a democracy can't survive like that.
So let's talk about, if we can, grounds for impeachment. So before the allegations broke about Trump's attempts to get the Ukrainian president to investigate Biden and son, what were the possible and likeliest impeachable offenses?
The convention in Philadelphia considered impeachment towards the end of the summer because the grounds for removal were so narrow, just bribery and treason. It was suggested that maladministration be added to those grounds. And that was rejected because the convention felt that this meant the president would serve at the pleasure of the Senate. So we do not have a parliamentary system, and the idea that just maladministration could be grounds for impeachment is something we have denied. Having said that, because bribery is quite hard to prove, you have to prove the intent of the person who's charged with bribery, that he or she took an action solely for the reasons of the bribe, rather than it being consistent with their political views. Because treason is so narrow and only applies during a war. It's not treason as we ordinarily use the term, but a much more narrowly defined issue. The convention added a phrase, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. That may strike you as vague, and many people think it's just whatever the House thinks it is, but that would be a real mistake. The crucial word is other. Bribery, treason, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So high crimes and misdemeanors are offenses like bribery and like treason. They don't have to be common crimes. There are many common crimes, I don't know, driving drunk or, I don't know, cheating on a restaurant bill and leaving without paying your tab or something that clearly are not impeachable offenses. And there are impeachable acts, like, for example, trying to barter American money or use of force in exchange for some interference with our political process that might not be common crimes, but are clearly impeachable offenses. So what you want to ask yourself is, do the alleged acts rise to the level of treason or bribery? Do they strike at the very heart of constitutional government, so that if they're proved, you would want to remove the person as a danger to the state?
Well, I think there are grounds to impeach the president. I think there are more than one, as you've mentioned. So then the question is, if there are grounds, should Congress impeach?
We've got grounds. Is there sufficient evidence on these articles to support articles of impeachment?
This is a legal proceeding, and it should roughly correspond to a grand jury proceeding in the House and a petit jury proceeding in the Senate. The Senate is called upon to try an impeachment, the way we try cases before courts. They take a special oath to uphold the law. The Chief Justice presides. So while I have my own opinions, I don't really want to solicit your agreement with me. I want you just to wait, let the process take its course, and let the persons who are asked to try this matter, if indeed it goes to that, to do so without public pressure. Now, things have changed a lot since this book was first written. This is the second edition. It was first written in 1974 when I was in law school, and it was during the Nixon impeachment. One of the things that Charles Black wrote was that, and I think I'm quoting him accurately, he said, "A snowstorm of telegrams should have no role in this process." Now, we've come quite a long way since then. The country has changed and the Congress has changed. But it is a legal proceeding. And I think the place for the evidence to play out is actually in a place where people are sworn to testimony and where it's evaluated by attorneys.
Democrats didn't impeach Nixon. Democrats forced Republicans to impeach Nixon. And that got to a point where the Republicans said, if we don't impeach him, I'm going to lose the next election, and I can't go before my constituents and defend what's happened. Now, having said go before my constituents, now senators represent an entire state, so their district hasn't changed. But the districts today are very different. The districts are very Republican or very Democrat. There are no blue dog Democrats of any consequence in Congress. Those are the centrist Democrats. There are basically few moderate Republicans who were centrist, the bridge between both sides. If you think of a bell curve, most Americans are in the middle, left, right, in the middle of this political. The most number of people in the country are way up there. In Congress, it's an inverted bell curve. So there are Republicans, even if this president does even more than he's done, they won't lose their election. They don't have to vote for impeachment. And now the senators, that may be a little different because they represent a whole state. But I'm just making the point to you, now the districts have gotten so partisan that you don't have the same dynamics that you had when Nixon was coming before the House.
I want to push back a little bit on you, Phil, when you say that wait for the Senate to act as adjudicators of evidence. It seems to me that we are now in a situation in a state where there is every day constant denial of evidence by, frankly, Republican senators. What credibility do they have to actually act as impartial adjudicators of evidence?
Well, we don't really have an alternative. This is our system. If the system is so corrupted that when evidence is taken under oath, not my opinion and hypothetical, but actual facts are tried, evidence to the contrary is presented in public and weighed, if there's really an overwhelming preponderance of evidence that, for example, the president has committed one of the offenses I suggested, and the Senate doesn't vote to convict, as they well may not for the reasons you've just heard, we've got a lot bigger problems than impeachment.
So let's, for a second, go back and look at both the Clinton and the Nixon impeachments. Compare for us the possible grounds for that we've already gone over for the Trump impeachment to the grounds for what you saw with Clinton. And then, Phil, I'd like you to do the same thing with Nixon. So, with Clinton, there was perjury before a grand jury.
Well, let's talk about Clinton. How do you defend to a police officer who would lose his job if he ever did anything even close to that? How do you defend that to any military person who would lose their job? How do you defend it to any CEO, male or female, if they did that? You couldn't defend it. I felt he should have resigned. But my problem was this. My problem was that the American people have a right to vote for someone who is not honorable, who is not good. They decide it's a sacred thing when they vote. And my view is when you overturn an election, you are overturning the will of the American people at a very crucial time. When it relates to Nixon, you literally had 5 people in the payroll of the White House, but they were downstairs in the basement, who went into the Democratic National Committee room and were caught. And the President of the United States knew it. So, that's pretty clear. Now, I can make the same point based on all the stuff that this president has done, that there are a lot of similarities. The thing that this president does, which is just destructive, he admits it. And then he says, no big deal. So, some people think he's an idiot, and some people think he's brilliant in an evil way. And so when he acknowledged, I had this phone call, we did talk about Biden and so on, the corruption that's going on and so on. Yeah, no big deal. He just swept it away, and there are a lot of constituents who think, no big deal. The President of the United States, no big deal. And so I just want to make this final point. What President Clinton did debased the office, so people are more willing to accept the defacement of the office by people who follow, because he got away with it.
Phil, take a look at the, let's talk about the Nixon impeachment again. Compare
Well, we
to
often
this.
think, there's some lawyers in the audience, we think of precedent as something that courts apply, and that's true. But precedent is also a very important form of argument for constitutional discussions with respect to the Congress and the President. So there are precedents here for impeachment, and as with precedents in case law, the most recent, most similar cases govern. So the Nixon impeachment, now almost 50 years in the past, 40-something years in the past, is a very distant precedent. There was no trial in the Senate, therefore obviously no conviction. Nixon resigned before he was even impeached, which is to say indicted. The intervening Clinton impeachment, which is more recent, actually, I'm sorry to say, is probably a more important precedent for us because it's so much more recent. With respect to the Nixon impeachment, Roger asked me to comment. I'd just say 3 things. One, the burglary of the DNC by these operatives, which I'm not sure Nixon did know about in advance, I don't know, is no different from the electronic burglary of the DNC by Russian operatives, whether or not President Trump or candidate Trump knew about it in advance. If President Trump took steps, either by bribery, that is, telling officials in the government that they would not be fired, or they would be promoted, or they'd be given preferment, if they stopped investigations into the Russian burglaries, or if he obstructed an investigation by dangling pardons, for example, before potential witnesses. If he did either or both of those things, then he really is on all fours with the Nixon precedent, and I think would be vulnerable to
I'm just curious that you say if.
The problems, I say, is with the more recent Clinton impeachment. I think Congressman Shays can be, he belongs in President Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage, to have stood up and bucked the anti-Clinton feelings about his constituents. And I think the reason he gave is one that I think is just the right one. Of course, it's shameful to be the commander-in-chief and want to be exonerated from doing things that members of the armed forces would be cashiered for. Of course, that's embarrassing and shameful. But, as Congressman Shays pointed out, the president is really the only person, the vice president doesn't really qualify here, he's the only person that everyone in the country either votes for or votes against and is then put in a national office. That puts him in a very different role. Now, once he's out of that role, he can be indicted and sent to prison. I don't think a sitting president can be indicted and tried.
So I come down at this point and believe that the major task is to defeat him and to defeat any Republican or Democrat that supports him.
If you looked at what happened in the Lewandowski hearing, with all of these representatives using their 5 minutes to say how smart they were and so on, it did not look like impartial questioning, like an attempt to get to the truth. Are we now...
Yes. No, I mean, but this has been a deterioration that's taken place over time. My point is, there are reasons, whether you like Republicans or not, that they had legitimate reason to not like a lot of things the Clinton administration did. So they think, some Republicans think they got away with it, and now you're going to treat this group differently. I'll end by saying, I think for the last 30 years, democracy hasn't worked in this country. And it's a horrible thing to say, but think of all the problems we're not addressing. And I can tell you why I think that's happening. But authoritarian rule are starting to win out over us.
If the president committed murder or rape while president, it would clearly constitute a high crime or misdemeanor. Bribery and treason are not misdemeanors, so why give undue weight to the word other in the Constitution? I guess that's for you.
Sure.
Thank goodness.
The misdemeanor, the term misdemeanor in high crimes and misdemeanors does not refer to the misdemeanors we have with common crimes. It's a phrase taken from the British practice at that time in the 18th century. High crimes and misdemeanors referred to crimes committed by royal officials. It has nothing to do with the misdemeanors that we contrast with felonies. Second, there is a debate about whether or not a very severe common crime, like murder, would be grounds for impeachment. My point was that it wouldn't. It would depend on the circumstances of the murder, whether or not it shook the foundations of the president's authority to govern. And the example I always gave was the Burr killing of Alexander Hamilton. Burr was vice president. He was hated by the president. He had been indicted for murder in 2 states, New Jersey and New York. He was a fugitive. There was tremendous political pressure to get him to resign, which he refused to do, but no one suggested that he could be impeached. Now, Charles, who was much wiser, he disagreed with me strongly. And he said, and perhaps this is what your questioner has in mind, that a president who committed a really serious common crime would simply have lost the respect of the public and he couldn't effectively govern. The last point is why we use the word other is a common legal construction. It's called ejusdem generis for any of our Latin scholars in the crowd. It just means things of the same kind. So if I say to the congressman, here's my credit card, I'd like you to go out and get some beer and some potato chips, and get some wine and some salsa, and we'll have a little after-debate party tonight. And he comes back with a new Corvette. I think he hasn't really understood ejusdem generis, beer, wine, chips, and things of a like kind.
Isn't the only way to get the president to share information out in the open to start the impeachment process?
No. Let me give you this hypothetical. Suppose you have a statute and it requires that a whistleblower in the intelligence community who has a complaint that he has forwarded to the IG, who finds it both compelling and urgent, is further required to give that to the two congressional intelligence committees by statute. And then further suppose that the allegation made by the whistleblower concerns a conversation between the president and a foreign head of state, which is probably at the apogee of executive privilege. The one thing you want to make certain was protected. These two are in conflict, and people of goodwill could come down on either side. Some saying we have to protect future presidents, some saying we have to obey the statute. Is that information going to get out by subpoena, congressional subpoena, or by a court order? Possibly, possibly not. Will it get out? Of course it will.
Chris, your thought?
My concern is when you have this process, if the Trump administration is able to stonewall it with the limited time you have left, it sets a precedent for the future. Because they got away with it, and some Democrat may have the same challenge later on, not like this, and they'll get away with it. So I don't want Congress to do something that they ultimately can't make sure happens.
We can't allow ourselves to be dragged down and to make rules that apply in the worst of cases to the worst of persons.
In Nixon versus U.S., the prosecutor subpoenaed the Watergate tapes on April 18th, 1974. On July 24th, the Supreme Court decided in favor of delivering the tapes. How can the Trump prosecution process be expedited? Can it be?
I'd be skeptical. The Nixon process was about 10 months. And although you're right, it went very quickly at the end. For a long time, it was just still an inquiry and investigation. I think if President Trump lost a court case in the Supreme Court about turning over material he regarded as privileged, there's a good chance he would not comply with the order. I don't think we thought that was likely when President Nixon was.
Eventually, there was the tape, there was the smoking gun. The Republicans decided he has crossed the ethical line. The challenge now, for me personally, is I don't see people seeing that line anymore.
I'm going to repeat a point because I believe this with all my heart and soul. There are too many Democrats and too many Republicans that represent such a partisan district that some of the partisan Republicans will pat their member on the back and say, thank goodness you didn't cave into those Democrats. They represent a different kind of district today. That's why gerrymandering is an issue that ultimately we're going to have to get to.
As a practical matter, when is it going to be too late to pursue impeachment?
From a strictly legal point of view, what I study and teach, it is never too late.
Are there alternatives,
Yeah.
good alternatives, legal alternatives to impeaching Trump? Could we censure him? Could you create a formal resolution to impeach him, but not do it?
You wouldn't want a joint resolution. That won't happen. That requires the president's signature. You probably couldn't get a concurrent resolution because the Senate, I'm just guessing, seems unlikely to go along with it. But you could have a motion of censure. The House could do that on their own. Sure.
Anything else? For example, could they
Isn't that enough?
impeach the guy and then Nancy Pelosi doesn't send it to the Senate for a vote? No, couldn't do that.
It's not a discretionary act on the Speaker's part, no.
How can the solution, Chris, be an election if the president is taking action to steal the election? If we do not address that through impeachment, what's the solution? The solution, a free election, becomes impossible.
Since there's not much you can do about it, you just have to make sure you get out enough votes to counteract whatever corrupt votes are on the other side.
Last question. This is for you, Phil. Are you suggesting that citizen activism in this process is irrelevant?
No, I don't think it's irrelevant, but I think it's very damaging. You will read and hear constantly that impeachment is a political process, not a legal process. I don't believe that, and I don't believe that anybody who really studies it would come to that conclusion. These are political actors, that's true, but they are acting in a juridical capacity, and this is emphasized over and over again in the Federalist Papers, at the convention. We have turned against that. We did in the Clinton impeachment. We turned away from that. We made it into a political process, and we are reaping the dividend of that mistake now. I don't know how you can get this country back on track, but one way I think you can keep it off track is by continuing to go down the process of politicizing decisions that are supposed to be legal decisions, and acting as though nothing has really changed. Everybody does it. This is the only way to combat bad actors. That's a much more profound problem than one particular president who in any case will be gone. That's a legacy that will infect our children and our children's children for generations.
We've had Phil and Chris here. We are grateful. I am grateful to hear them. And thank you for coming.
Lovely to be with you.
Thank you.